the most successful thefts in British history was the so-called Great Train Robbery. On the 8th of August 1963, a gang of about 15 men held up the travelling post office train en route from Glasgow to London. Tampering with the signals at Sears Crossing, the robbers then took the uncoupled money train to Bridego Railway Bridge at Ledburn in Buckinghamshire. There, they stole around £2.6 million, the equivalent of about 40 million in today's money, and over 8 times the amount usually carried on the train due to a Scottish bank holiday. The gang had no guns, a fact which accounts for the response to them from the British public. By some, the robbers were regarded almost affectionately, but the crime was not really a victimless one. The co-driver, David Whitby, was thrown down a railway embankment, and the driver, Jack Mills, was abducted before being hit over the head with an iron bar, causing trauma headaches for the rest of his life. An anonymous tip-off led to the arrests and imprisonment of 13 members of the gang. The most famous, Ronnie Biggs, escaped after 15 months and lived for many years in Australia and Brazil before returning home to England in 2001 at the age of 71, citing increasing ill health and mounting medical bills in Brazil. He was sent back to jail with 28 years of his sentence remaining. In July 2007, he was moved to Norwich Prison on compassionate grounds. This is the Imola racetrack in Italy. In 2004, around 1,000 fans gathered there to mark the 10-year anniversary of the death of their hero, 34-year-old Brazilian racing driver Ayrton Senna da Silva. Even today, Senna is considered by some to be the greatest Formula One racing driver of all time. His achievements in the sport were outstanding. He won the World Championship 3 times and scored 65 pole positions in 162 races. He won the Monaco Grand Prix 6 times, 5 times consecutively between 1989 and 1993. This record still stands. Having parted company from the McLaren racing team in 1993, on the 1st of May of the following year, Senna lined up for his 3rd race with the Williams-Renault team at Imola. And as was so often the case, he began the race in pole position. But 7 laps into the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, Senna's vehicle broke traction twice at the rear, left the track at Tamburello Corner and slammed into a concrete barrier at 218 kilometers per hour. Despite losing a wheel and the nose cone, the car didn't seem to have sustained much damage. But it soon became apparent that Senna's helmet was punctured at the top of the visor. It is thought that the tyre and the attached piece of suspension had hit him, causing a fatal cranial trauma. His death was even more poignant, coming only one day after a crash had claimed the life of Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger in practice at the same event. Senna had been greatly affected by Ratzenberger's death, which reinforced safety fears that already concerned him. He insisted on visiting the crash site to see what went wrong. And when his car was examined following his accident the next day, a blood-soaked Austrian flag was found inside. He had been intending to raise it as his victory flag in honor of Ratzenberger. As the news of his death spread, the Brazilian government declared 3 days of national mourning, and he was given a state funeral. It was the first death in a Formula One event for 12 years, and controversy surrounded the tragedy when it was suggested that in the 2 separate accidents, both he and Ratzenberger had died immediately, but had been kept on life support until away from the track, so that the event wouldn't be abandoned, in line with racing laws. More controversy loomed over the roadworthiness of the car itself, and for many years the Williams team fought a manslaughter charge through the Italian courts. They were eventually found not guilty. Senna's driving prowess wasn't his only legacy, however. After his death, it was revealed that he had donated millions of dollars to children's charities and founded an institution to help the disadvantaged, which is still thriving today. For over 30 years, the TSMS Laconia had a varied and successful history as a passenger liner, troop carrier, and cruise ship. On the 22nd of December 1963, she was 550 miles northwest of Casablanca and 3 days into an 11-day Christmas cruise. At about 11 p.m, a fire caused by faulty wiring started in the ship's hairdressing salon. It spread rapidly, but the order to abandon ship wasn't given until a couple of hours later. And despite the ship passing a safety inspection 24 hours before setting sail, there were serious safety issues overlooked. Many of the lifeboats were unusable due to rusted chains, and lockers containing life-saving equipment could not be opened. Other lifeboats burned before they could be launched, and one survivor later complained that the fire alarm was so weak it sounded like someone ringing a waiter for tea. Though many survivors were picked up, there was still a heavy loss of life. Out of the 1,022 people on board, a total of 128 died. A couple of days later, some tugboats began towing the badly damaged ship to Gibraltar. But on the 29th of December, she rolled over and sank in only 3 minutes. Cliveden House, the Buckinghamshire mansion that in its time has been home to the Astor family and various dukes, but really earned its infamy in the early 60s when it became known as the place where Cabinet Minister John Profumo met topless showgirl Christine Keeler. There's nothing the great British public and the not-so-great British media like better than a sex scandal, a spy scandal, or a political one. But when you get all three together, that's the best thing of all. And to this day, the Profumo affair is the one that people still talk about. Profumo met Keeler at a party organised by the society osteopath Stephen Ward and had a brief affair with her, despite being married to actress Valerie Hobson. Keeler was at the time close friends with Mandy Rice Davis, whose vivacity and ready wit brought an even greater spotlight on the affair. The scandal really developed when news of the affair spread, coupled with the revelation that Keeler was also seeing Yevgeny Ivanov, a naval attaché at the Soviet embassy. Considering Britain was in the middle of the Cold War, the security breach implications of this led to questions in the House of Commons, with Profumo compounding his disgrace by at first lying about the affair, saying there had been no impropriety whatsoever. When Profumo was finally forced to admit the truth, his position became untenable, and he resigned from the cabinet on the 5th of June 1963. The ripple effect spread to Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who stepped down in October with deteriorating health. Stephen Ward was charged with living on the immoral earnings of prostitution and committed suicide in August, while Christine Keeler was sentenced to 9 months in prison on unrelated perjury charges concerning another boyfriend, Aloysius Gordon, known as Lucky. Keeler kept a fairly low profile during the whole Profumo affair, although she did pose for photographer Lewis Morley. The resulting shot remains one of the most iconic British images of the 1960s. In 2001, she published her autobiography, The Truth at Last. John Profumo, having kept a promise never to talk about the scandal again, died in 2006, having finally restored his reputation after many years of charity work. Mandy Rice Davis, on the other hand, had plenty to say for herself. She was called to give evidence at Stephen Ward's trial, and when the prosecution remarked that Lord Astor had denied any knowledge or relationship with her, she replied, "Well, he would, wouldn't he?" The quote has since entered popular usage, especially amongst British politicians. In fact, it was probably Rice Davis who came out of the whole Profumo scandal the best. She traded on her notoriety, married a businessman from Israel, and went on to open a number of successful nightclubs and restaurants in Tel Aviv. She also released records and worked as an actress, even appearing in an episode of Absolutely Fabulous in 1994. Brixton, 1985. Toxteth, 1981. Notting Hill, 1958. The list of race riots in the UK is a long and inglorious one, but some are more memorable than others. The events of August and September 1958 in Notting Hill certainly stand out, but not quite so well remembered is that there was also trouble in the Midland city of Nottingham. It all seemed to begin on the 23rd of August in a pub in St Anne's Well Road, and is believed to have been sparked by outrage over interracial relationships, black men and white women. The roots of the tension were clearly much deeper than that, though, stretching back to the end of the post-war economic highs that had brought Caribbean immigrants to Britain in the first place. Dubbed by some the Teddy Boy riots, after the visible presence of that particular working-class male subculture, the riots resulted in many stabbings and resurfaced a week later. This time, though, the largely white crowd turned on itself, leading to a brawl and many arrests. Meanwhile, events in Notting Hill in West London were focusing attention further south. Apparently triggered by an attack on a white Swedish woman married to a West Indian man, the riots and disturbances carried on for several nights. Over 140 people were arrested, and 9 white men convicted of serious assault received 4-year prison sentences in what became known as exemplary sentencing, harsh punishment intended to act as a deterrent. Six years later, Claudia Jones started the now world-famous Notting Hill Carnival as a response to the unrest and an attempt to improve the state of race relations in Britain. Nobody really knows why the man-eating lions of Tsavo behaved the way they did, although there are plenty of theories. Despite their appearances, these big cats were not lionesses, but male lions without manes. And some think that it was their unusually high levels of testosterone that both diminished their hair and considerably raised their levels of aggression. The lions were also much bigger than normal. The Tsavo beasts were reckoned to weigh 500 pounds and were 10 feet long. They also both had abscesses under their teeth, leading scientists to conclude that they were simply in too much pain to hunt and eat tougher prey. Or were the events of the late 19th century simply explained by an outbreak of rinderpest disease, a cattle plague which had wiped out much of the lion's usual prey? Local legends are more fanciful, however. It is believed by many that the lions were summoned by African shamans who didn't want the iron snake of the railway encroaching on their land. Whatever the reason, the 2 Tsavo man-eaters were able to terrorise Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson and his men as they attempted to build a bridge as part of the Uganda Railway over Tsavo River in Kenya from March 1898. Patterson only kept detailed records of the deaths of his skilled workers, not the indigenous Africans, so exact figures have been disputed. But by December of that year, around 135 workers had been dragged out of their tents and eaten. Patterson did everything he could to try and hunt down the animals, finally shooting the first lion on the 8th of December. The second was killed 3 weeks later. And as recently as 2000, museum staff at the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History came up with another theory to explain the lion's abnormal hunger for human flesh. They suggested that the lions had scavenged the graves of inadequately buried dead railway workers and moved from that to live, sleeping people. Patterson's journals confirmed that burial mounds had been disturbed and bodies eaten. Whatever the truth, the man-eating lions of Tsavo have now taken on legendary status, leading to their appearance in books and such movies as The Ghost in the Darkness, starring Michael Douglas, and Val Kilmer as Patterson. Of all the tragedies that have taken place in sporting arenas, one of the most ignominious would have to be the Heysel Stadium disaster of the 29th of May, 1985. This is for the simple reason that it was triggered not by an accident or an act of God, but by hooliganism. The occasion was the final of the European Cup. England's powerhouse team, Liverpool Football Club, were to play the top Italian team, Juventus, at the ageing Heysel Stadium in Brussels. With around 60,000 fans in attendance, the ground had been cordoned off to keep the fans of the opposing team separate. One section, however, had been reserved for neutral supporters, and with the tickets acquired by travel agents and touts, this resulted in a number of Juventus fans finding themselves in close proximity to their sworn enemies. With just a flimsy fence dividing them, the Liverpool supporters rushed the barrier an hour before kick-off. As the Juventus supporters scrambled to get away, they backed into a crumbling wall, which collapsed, killing 39 people and injuring hundreds more. There is confusion about whether the organisers and players knew exactly what had happened, but it was decided to continue with the game anyway to prevent further disturbances. Juventus won 1-0, thanks to a penalty by Michel Platini. After the match, policing and stadium concerns were ignored, with Liverpool receiving all the blame. The club was banned indefinitely from European competition, as were all other English clubs. The ban lasted for 5 years. This is the capital city of the Republic of Macedonia, which sits on the Vara River. In 1963, while it was still part of President Tito's Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the city was hit, not for the first time, by a massive earthquake. It had already been nearly wiped out in 518 AD, and again at the end of the 11th century. This time, the first tremor was felt at 5 a.m. on the morning of the 26th of July. It measured 6.1 on the Richter scale and killed more than 1,000 people. 80% of the city was destroyed, and 120,000 citizens lost their homes. At the time, the population was only around 200,000 in total. Rescue teams from across Yugoslavia were swiftly mobilized, and a significant international relief fund meant that the city was quickly rebuilt. But many historical and cultural monuments were lost forever, as were elements of the city's Ottoman heritage. Today, next to a museum, the ruins of the old train station still stand, turned into a memorial for those that lost their lives in the quake. Saddam Hussein was by no means the first despot in Iraqi history. Baghdad's military past features a long line of dictators, coups and counter-coups. One of the bloodiest took place on the 8th of February 1963. It was a coup d'etat, orchestrated by the Ba'athist Party, which included Saddam, to topple President Abdul Karim Qasim. In the fighting, 5,000 Iraqis were killed, with the Ba'athists numbering their own losses at 80. The motivation for overthrowing Qasim was suspected to be pan-Arabist influence and state control over oil. It was carried out with the backing of the American CIA and the British government, and resulted in a house-to-house hunt for members of the Communist Party. Ironically, Qasim himself had come to power only 5 years earlier in another coup. On the 14th of July 1958, he and his adherents had seized military control over the Iraqi capital, overthrowing the monarchy and executing several members of the royal family. By 1963, he had withdrawn the country from the pro-Western Baghdad Pact, lifted the ban on the Communist Party, and established relationships with the Soviet Union. Moves like seizing 98% of Iraqi land from the British-owned Iraq Petroleum Company served to increase Western hostility. The CIA was so keen to see him removed, it joined forces with the small but militant Ba'athist Party to plot Qasim's downfall. Foreshadowing Saddam Hussein's own demise 43 years later, Qasim was executed after a show trial on the 9th of February 1963. The Democratic Republic of Congo, like many other former colonies, faced a long period of political instability and complicated maneuverings following its independence from its old colonizers Belgium in 1960. The next 5 years became known as the Congo Crisis, with the establishment of the First Republic ushering in a period of turmoil which had various elements. To begin with, there was the anti-colonial struggle, compounded by yet another displaced Cold War battle, with the United States and the Soviet Union becoming involved. There were also successionist battles, particularly in the province of Katanga. Katanga was one of the richest areas of the Congo, with copper, gold and uranium mines. It was led by Moise Tshombe, who declared independence from the rest of the country on the 11th of July 1960. With much of these mineral resources under the control of Belgian industrial companies, the Belgian government supported the bid for independence, helping the police force to become militarized and sending troops. And at the center of the Katanga fighting forces were several hundred European mercenaries, many of them Belgian nationals. Eventually, the United Nations became involved, establishing a peacekeeping force in the area after its Security Council Resolution 143 of July 1960, which asked the Belgian government to remove its forces from the territory. The Secretary-General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, set up a UN force which remained in the Congo until 1964. At its peak, it numbered nearly 20,000, but the soldiers' blue helmets were a sign that they were there to keep the peace and could only use arms in self-defense. The first UN troops arrived in Katanga in mid-July, and by September the Belgian troops had all withdrawn. But not before Hammarskjöld had tried to intervene personally, only to be killed in a plane crash en route to the trouble spot. His death came in the middle of Operation Mortha, launched by the UN on the 9th of September, when it became clear that Tshombe's mercenaries were still in control of the gendarmerie. The operation went badly for the UN, amidst claims that it still had no official mandate to do anything but keep the peace. The fighting dragged on in Katanga until December 1962, when the UN initiated Operation Grand Slam, which proved decisive. By 1963, the capital city Elizabethville was under UN control, and the bid for independence was over. When an entire country becomes associated with an epithet like the Killing Fields, it certainly warrants inclusion in any list of infamous places. This was the term used to describe the mass grave sites of Cambodia in the late 1970s. Officially renamed as the Democratic Kampuchea, the country under the rule of the Khmer Rouge was a very grim place indeed. The Khmer Rouge was a radical political regime that formulated its doctrines throughout the 1960s in Vietnamese border camps. It believed that rural peasant farmers were the true working-class proletarians and the backbone of the revolution. After a prolonged period of increasing their control over the rest of the country, the Khmer Rouge eventually captured the capital Phnom Penh on the 17th of April 1975, with Saloth Sar officially becoming Prime Minister in May. Saloth Sar is better known as Pol Pot. Once in power, Pol Pot could continue the doctrines that eventually saw between 1.7 and 2 million Cambodians exterminated, out of a population of only 7 million. Pol Pot promoted the idea of a primitivist agrarian future. This included a radical policy of relocation, with cities emptied and dissidents forcibly re-educated or disposed of in mass graves they were forced to dig themselves. The most well-known of the killing fields is Choang Ek. It now houses a Buddhist memorial to the genocide. The Khmer Rouge was eventually brought down following an invasion by Vietnam in 1979. The movement was not destroyed, though, with Vietnam using their resistance as an excuse to retain its military presence in Cambodia, and Khmer Rouge representatives retaining their seats at the United Nations. Pol Pot fled and lived in the woods on the Thai border, before finally dying in controversial circumstances on the 15th of April 1998. He was never brought to justice for his actions.